It was supposed to be a regular Friday night, just a way to blow off steam after a long week. My best friend Dylan had convinced me to hit up a local bar, something we'd done countless times before. But as soon as we sat down and ordered our first drinks, there was an energy in the air, something I couldn't quite name. The bar was our usual spot, cozy and dimly lit, with music that wasn't too loud, perfect for conversations that would stretch into the night. We started out like any other night, laughing about work, telling stories from our week, and even mocking some of our past relationships. But tonight the drinks felt stronger, and the laughs lasted longer. Maybe it was just the alcohol talking, but I felt different around Dylan, more aware of his presence, of every casual brush of his arm. As the hours passed, our conversations got a little deeper, more vulnerable. We drifted from the usual banter to memories of our college days, the crazy nights, the regrets, and the dreams we still held on to. Dylan had always been easy to talk to. He knew things about me that no one else did. And as the drinks kept coming, I felt a warmth in his gaze that seemed to linger longer than usual. Somewhere between our third and fourth rounds, Dylan leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath on my face. "You know," he said, his voice lower than before, "I don't think I've ever really thanked you for everything. You've been there for me through so much." I laughed, trying to brush off the sudden intensity, but there was something in his eyes that kept me rooted in place. "Hey, that's what friends are for, right?" I replied, hoping to keep things light. He just smiled, a little crookedly, and took another sip of his drink. "Yeah, but I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're more than that." His words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. I felt my heart pound, a mixture of excitement and confusion settling in. Was it the alcohol, or was there something here that I'd been too afraid to acknowledge? We stayed like that for a moment, just staring at each other, neither of us daring to break the silence. My mind was racing, every rational thought drowned out by the rush of emotions I was feeling. Before I could think better of it, I found myself leaning in, inching closer to him, drawn by something I couldn't explain. Dylan didn't pull away. Instead, he matched my movement, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before meeting my eyes again. The room felt smaller, quieter, like it was just the two of us in this moment that we were both too afraid to name. But then, just as our faces were inches apart, he chuckled and leaned back, breaking the spell. "I think we've had too much to drink," he said, laughing it off. "We should probably head back before we end up doing something we regret." I forced a laugh, nodding in agreement, though a part of me felt a strange sense of loss. "Yeah, good call. Let's get out of here." We stumbled out of the bar, still laughing, leaning on each other for balance as we made our way back to our apartment building. The cool night air did little to clear the haze in my mind, and every accidental touch sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that a line had almost been crossed, and now we were teetering on the edge. Back at the apartment, I fumbled with my keys, the silence between us suddenly heavy again. As soon as we got inside, I turned to say goodnight, but he was right there, standing closer than he needed to. There was a look in his eyes, one that made my pulse race all over again. "Hey, thanks for tonight," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed, my mind spinning. "Anytime, Dylan. You know I'm always here." He gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I know." For a moment, it looked like he was going to say something more, but instead, he just nodded and turned toward his room, leaving me standing alone in the dim light of the hallway. I watched him go, my chest tight, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had almost happened, that we had almost crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I replayed every moment, every word, every glance. I couldn't help but wonder, was it all in my head? Or had I just seen a side of Dylan that he was just as afraid to show as I was to see? One thing was for sure, this night had changed everything. And whether I was ready or not, there was no going back. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a blur of memories from the night before. But even through the haze, one thing was clear. There was a tension between Dylan and me that hadn't been there before. It was like a thread stretched tight, ready to snap with the slightest pull. As I walked into the kitchen, I saw him already there, sipping coffee, looking like he hadn't slept much either. He glanced up, gave me a small, tentative smile, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But then, his eyes lingered just a bit too long, and I felt that familiar rush of emotions that had taken me by surprise last night. "Rough night, huh?" he said, trying to break the silence. "Yeah," I laughed, rubbing the back of my neck. "Maybe we overdid it a bit." He chuckled, but there was something forced about it, like he was trying to keep things light, to pretend nothing had happened. I wanted to ask him about last night, about the moment we almost had, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't want to ruin our friendship by reading too much into a drunken moment, even if it had felt so real to me. For the rest of the day, we went through the motions, watching TV, grabbing food, making small talk. But no matter how hard we tried, the tension was there, simmering beneath the surface. Every brush of his arm against mine, every shared glance, felt charged, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was as aware of it as I was. That evening, we decided to watch a movie, a familiar routine that usually involved us lounging on the couch, half paying attention to the screen. But tonight, everything felt different. We sat close, maybe closer than necessary, and every time he shifted, every time he laughed, I felt my heart race. Halfway through the movie, he leaned over to grab his drink, and his arm brushed against mine, lingering for just a second longer than it needed to. I felt a shiver run through me, and when I glanced over, I saw him looking back, his expression unreadable. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes flicking down to my lips before he quickly looked away. "Nothing," he muttered, sitting back and focusing on the screen. But that moment hung between us, unspoken and undeniable. I wanted to say something, to ask him what he was feeling, but I was scared. Scared of his answer, scared of what it might mean for us. So instead, I kept quiet, letting the silence fill the room. After the movie ended, we sat there in the dark, neither of us moving to turn the lights back on. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, and I knew that if I didn't say something now, I might never get the chance. "Dylan," I started, my voice shaky. "About last night." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something else I couldn't quite place. "Yeah? I don't know. It felt like something changed. Between us, I mean." He looked down, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "I don't know what you're talking about." But I could see it in his eyes, the same fear, the same uncertainty. He was just as scared as I was, just as unsure about where this was going. And in that moment, I realized that maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. "Dylan, come on, you know what I mean," I pressed, my heart pounding. "Last night, it felt like there was something between us, and I need to know if I'm just imagining it." He didn't answer right away, and for a moment I thought he might brush it off, make a joke, or change the subject. But then he looked at me, his gaze intense, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability I'd never seen before. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe you're not the only one who felt it." My heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and excitement flooding through me. For so long, I'd kept these feelings buried, convinced that they were one-sided. But now, hearing him admit that he might feel the same, it was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. We sat there, neither of us daring to move, the silence stretching between us. I could feel my pulse racing, every nerve in my body on high alert. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that this was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment where everything could change. But then, Just as I was about to say something, to close the distance between us, he pulled back, a look of uncertainty crossing his face. I need some time to think, he said, his voice shaky. It's a lot. I nodded, trying to hide the disappointment that was gnawing at me. I understood. This was new for both of us, and rushing it could ruin everything. Yeah, of course. Take all the time you need. He gave me a small, grateful smile, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But instead, he just nodded and got up, retreating to his room, leaving me alone in the dark. As I sat there, the weight of his words settled over me. He felt it too. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't just in my head. But now all I could do was wait, hoping that he'd come to terms with his feelings, hoping that we hadn't just ruined the friendship that meant everything to me. And as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The next few days passed in a blur of mixed emotions. Dylan and I went about our routines, our conversations reduced to small talk and awkward silences. The tension between us had only intensified, and every time I caught his gaze, my heart would race, wondering if he was thinking about that night as much as I was. One evening, he suggested we grab a drink at a bar near campus, as if returning to our usual routine could bridge the gap that had grown between us. I agreed, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a few drinks would loosen the grip of tension and bring back the ease we used to share. At the bar, we took our seats in a cozy corner, and I tried to focus on anything other than how close he was, the way his arm brushed against mine, the warmth of his presence. We talked about our classes, about the endless stress of exams, but it felt forced, like we were both avoiding the real conversation that hung heavy in the air. After a couple of drinks, he seemed to relax a bit, laughing and joking as if nothing had changed. But there was something in his laughter, a hint of nervousness that didn't go unnoticed. I was about to bring it up, to ask him if he was feeling the same uncertainty, but he beat me to it. Listen, he started, looking down at his drink, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. About the other night. I don't want things to get weird between us. You're my best friend, you know? I don't want to lose that. I nodded, my chest tightening as I searched for the right words. I get it. I don't want to lose what we have either. But I also can't ignore what I felt. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the same vulnerability he'd shown that night. Yeah, he said quietly. I felt it too. The admission hung between us, raw and real, and I felt a surge of courage. Then maybe we shouldn't pretend it didn't happen. I mean, it doesn't have to change anything, right? We can just see where it goes? He was quiet, his gaze dropping again, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. But what if it does change things? What if it makes everything more complicated? Maybe it already has, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and something else, something that mirrored the emotion swirling inside me. Slowly, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, barely more than a touch, but it sent a shockwave through me, my skin tingling at the contact. I don't know what this is, he murmured, his voice filled with uncertainty, but I don't want to lose you. You won't, I replied, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. No matter what happens, you're still my best friend. That won't change. He smiled, a hint of relief softening his features, and for the first time in days, I felt like maybe things would be okay. We didn't have all the answers, and there was still a lot left unsaid, but for now, this moment was enough. We finished our drinks, the silence between us comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. And as we walked back to our apartment, side by side, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something incredible. When we reached the apartment, he turned to me, his eyes holding a quiet intensity. Thanks, for being patient with me. I know I'm not the easiest person to figure out. I smiled, feeling a surge of affection. You're worth it. He chuckled, the sound low and warm, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to say something else. But instead, he just nodded, giving my shoulder a light, lingering squeeze before heading to his room. As I lay in bed that night, my heart felt lighter, the uncertainty giving way to a quiet optimism. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. And as long as we were in this together, I knew we'd find a way through, one step at a time. Days went by, and although the tension between Dylan and me had eased, there was still an unspoken weight that lingered in the air. Our friendship felt stronger than ever, but now there was something else, a current pulling us closer that neither of us could ignore. I found myself savoring every moment with him, each shared laugh, every lingering look, wondering if he felt it too. One evening, as we were studying in the living room, a storm started brewing outside, and a sudden flash of lightning made the power flicker. We laughed it off, but when the lights finally cut out completely, the laughter faded into silence, leaving only the sound of rain pounding against the windows. "Guess we're stuck in the dark," Dylan said, his voice low, almost contemplative. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness, as if the storm outside mirrored the tension between us. "Guess so," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual even though my heart was pounding. He reached for his phone, using its flashlight to cast a soft glow over the room. In the dim light, I could see his face, his expression unreadable, yet intense. He looked at me, and I felt that pull again, stronger this time, like there was something inevitable about this moment. Without thinking, I moved closer, the darkness and the sound of the storm creating a bubble around us. "You know," I murmured, "I don't think I've ever been this nervous around you." He gave a small laugh, but it was tinged with the same tension I felt. "Me neither," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence heavy with possibilities. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like we were both stepping over a line we'd been too scared to cross. "Dylan," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "I don't know where this is going yet, but I think I want to find out." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and then, without another word, he closed the distance between us. His lips met mine, tentative at first, as if testing the waters, but then the kiss deepened, filled with a longing that had been building for far too long. It was everything I hadn't known I'd wanted, gentle, intense, and more real than anything I'd ever felt. When we finally pulled back, he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and relief. "I guess I've been waiting for that," he admitted, his voice soft but steady. "Me too," I replied, feeling a smile spread across my face. We didn't say much after that, but the silence was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, everything felt calm, like we'd finally found the answer we'd been searching for. As the night wore on, we ended up falling asleep on the couch, our hands intertwined, a quiet sense of peace settling over us. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, I felt certain about one thing. I wanted him in my life, in every way possible. The following morning, I woke up to find Dylan still beside me, his hand still holding mine. The memory of last night's kiss lingered, a warmth in my chest that made everything feel surreal, and yet, so right. I wanted to stay in that moment forever, just the two of us, untouched by the outside world. But reality had a way of sneaking back in, and I knew we'd eventually have to talk about what had happened. Dylan stirred, slowly opening his eyes. When he saw me, he gave a small, sleepy smile that made my heart race all over again. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, smiling back. I wanted to say something about last night, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me was afraid of ruining this delicate new connection between us. He must have sensed my hesitation because he squeezed my hand gently. "About last night," he started, his voice soft but steady. "I don't regret it, not even for a second." Relief washed over me and I felt myself relax. "Me neither," I said, meeting his gaze. I didn't expect this to happen, but I'm glad it did." We sat in silence for a moment, just taking in the gravity of what we'd both admitted. It was as if we'd crossed a line, but rather than feeling lost, I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. He took a deep breath, and I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, a side of him I'd never seen before. "I know this might be complicated," he said, his tone cautious, "but I want to figure this out. With you." A surge of joy filled me, and I couldn't keep the smile off my face. "I want that too," I replied, feeling a new sense of hope. For once, I felt like things were clear, like I was finally starting to understand my own feelings. The rest of the day was a quiet one, filled with small, stolen moments that felt intimate and meaningful. Every time our eyes met, there was a spark, a reminder of what had shifted between us. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, but I knew I was ready to see where this would lead. As evening fell, we found ourselves sitting together on the couch, the same place where everything had changed. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, with exactly who I was meant to be with. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, each moment with Dylan bringing us closer. We were still figuring things out, but the uncertainty that had once clouded my thoughts was slowly fading. For the first time, I felt truly at ease, as if I was no longer holding back from the person I wanted to be. One evening, after a quiet dinner at my place, we found ourselves on the couch again, laughing about something trivial. His laugh was infectious, and before I knew it, I was laughing too, caught up in the warmth of his presence. There was a lightness between us now, a comfort that felt effortless. As our laughter faded, Dylan looked at me with a seriousness in his eyes that made my heart pound. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I think I've known for a while that I wanted this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was just too afraid to admit it. I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "Me too," I replied, my voice equally soft. "I didn't think this would ever happen. But now that it has, I don't want to let it go." Without another word, he leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that felt like a promise. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, but deep and sincere, as if we were both finally ready to accept what had been building between us. When we pulled back, he smiled, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and happiness. "So, what now?" he asked, his tone playful yet genuine. I took a deep breath, realizing that this was just the beginning. "I don't know," I admitted, smiling. "But whatever it is, I want to figure it out with you." We spent the rest of the night talking about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears, letting the walls between us dissolve completely. It was a night of honesty, of vulnerability, and by the time the sun started to rise, I knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. Dylan and I weren't just best friends anymore. We were something more, something that felt unbreakable. And as I lay beside him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, stronger and happier than ever. Sometimes life doesn't go as planned, but it's often these unexpected journeys that transform us the most. In the end, we discover not only who we truly are, but also what we're capable of building when we have the courage to live our truth. So I ask you, what would you be willing to risk for a real connection? Have you ever faced a moment where your own happiness seemed to hinge on a difficult choice? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we continue to explore intense, reflective, and inspiring stories. Don't miss the next emotional journey.